We're talking about intelligence on this episode. I am pleased to be here with Dr. Wesley Wark, a leading expert on national security, intelligence, and terrorism. Dr. Wark is currently a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa and is recently retired from the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs, where he has taught since 1988, a leading institution, I must say. Today we are talking about espionage. We're talking about spies and the like, Jack Ryan and those sorts of things. Could Canada have prevented COVID-19 deaths if it had better intelligence? Given increasingly better technology, should we be afraid of an Orwellian state in Canada? To what extent should foreign entities be limited in their ownership of vital Canadian assets, such as telecommunications? We have the case of Huawei, of course, that we will discuss these and other questions in this interview. First of all, Dr. Wark, many of my viewers, many of my listeners will not understand a lot of the jargon. This discussion can become jargon heavy. Let's just agree on that. Could you please explain a few terms to us? First of all, what is signals intelligence, for instance, and how does it differ from on-the-ground intelligence?
Okay, good. Listen, Cornelius, I'm looking forward to our chat. Thanks for the invitation. I would start by saying that there is certainly a jargon around intelligence, but it can be cool to appreciate it because it gives you some insights. So I think the starting point, there's obviously abbreviations for all kinds of agencies, and some people would be more familiar with these than others, CIA, MI6, and so on and so forth. But in terms of the basics of intelligence, I think the place that we need to start is an understanding of the different kinds of collection methodologies, I call them. So there are different disciplines of intelligence, if you like. They all have their acronyms. And the main ones really are four. And I'll just go through these very quickly. So the first and the oldest technique for intelligence gathering and collection is called human intelligence. And that, as everyone will understand, is basically the business of employing spies to try and acquire information that might be of interest to a government using such means. So that's human. And that's been around, obviously, for centuries. The 20th century began to see a kind of expansion of the means by which intelligence was collected. And so new intelligence methodologies come along, new intelligence disciplines, and new acronyms. So on top of human, around the time of the First World War, we see two additional ways, important ways of collecting intelligence. One called signals intelligence, or SIGINT, which in the First World War context and for a while afterwards was really just intercepting radio communications. And now it's much more complex, obviously technologically. And then the First World War, thanks to the invention of the Wright brothers, brought about another kind of intelligence collection discipline, which is generally called IMINT, or imagery intelligence. And so in the First World War, this was biplanes. Nowadays, it's spy satellites. So there's been that progression. And then along with the information revolution, there has come another form of intelligence gathering, which is generally referred to as open source intelligence, or OSINT. So those are the four key methodologies. They all have different kind of lifespans in terms of how old or how new they are. Human, SIGINT, IMINT, OSINT. So those are the four basics.
I'm sorry, what is open source intelligence? Does this mean anybody can access the information?
So open source intelligence is a form of collecting information in the public domain, or more or less in the public domain. That is, you're not collecting secrets, but you're trying to go out there into that kind of vast space of information, generated by the internet in particular, and including by social media, of course. You're going into that vast information space, and you're trying to pull out information that may be of value. But the key characteristic is it's out there in the public domain, and intelligence services are trying to figure out ways to find value in all that information to them.
All right, so tell us a little bit about Canada's different spy agencies. We have CSIS, we have the CSE, and Canadian Forces Intelligence. What are their different roles, and what kinds of intelligence, what kinds of four of those intelligence do they focus on?
Yeah, okay. So we have two main intelligence collection agencies. There's the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, which has been around since 1984, and it was created in 1984 after a Royal Commission found that its predecessor, the RCMP security service, had been engaged in illegal operations and wasn't very well suited to doing more sophisticated forms of intelligence collection and analysis. So we have a civilian Canadian Security Intelligence Service that is mostly, but not exclusively, focused on gathering national security information within Canada.
Hmm.
Then the other main intelligence collector we have is the Communications Security Establishment, it's called. That agency has a long history that goes back to the Second World War. It was called different things at different times, but from 1970 on, it's been called the Communications Security Establishment, and its job is to primarily collect foreign intelligence using access to what they call the global information infrastructure, or what we might call the internet, basically, and the data systems surrounding the internet. So it's foreign focused, CSE. CSIS is domestically focused. And then the third group that you mentioned, the Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, or CFINCOM, another abbreviation, is a more recent vintage, and that is an entity that exists to support the armed forces by way of intelligence collection for its missions and to do a lot of intelligence analysis of information that comes to it.
Now, you mentioned that CSIS was created in the wake of an RCMP scandal. What was that scandal?
It was a scandal that was really rooted in the turbulence of Quebec politics in the 1970s, the FLQ crisis in 1970, and then the ongoing concern about the potential for kind of violent, subversive activities on the extremes of Quebec politics. So the RCMP Security Service was tasked with kind of monitoring violent, subversive political activity in Quebec. They weren't given very clear kind of legal or operational guidelines. They were kind of set loose on this problem on the assumption that they hadn't done very well with regard to the FLQ crisis, which may not have been a fair assumption, in fact. But they got involved in different kinds of operations against FLQ splinter groups that obviously just exceeded their legal authorities, or any authorities that the government of the day was comfortable with. And these eventually came to light, more or less by accident, in a related Quebec court case, and then that generated both a provincial inquiry and then a federal government royal commission in the late 1970s that looked at the activities of the RCMP and said, this agency is not doing the work that needs to be done, and we need something different. We need a different set of laws to conduct intelligence in Canada.
Oh, whenever you see these TV shows, you often see these police investigating a crime scene, and then these FBI guys drive in and they say, this is now in the court of the FBI, right? This is now the FBI's case. Do these intelligence agencies ever overlap and even conflict in their mandates? You know, when, for example, I can think of a situation, if there's foreign interference in Canada, is that CSIS, or is that CSE? Is that RCMP? What is that? Which agency decides who's going to take the case?
So it's a great question. I mean, we can separate out quickly the Communications Security Establishment or Canadian Forces Intelligence Group. They're not really meant to do domestic intelligence gathering work. Mm-hmm. But where you do have the possibility for overlap and maybe some conflict and confusion is between CSIS and the RCMP. And the RCMP, although it doesn't any longer have an intelligence mission of the kind that it used to have before CSIS came along, still has an important law enforcement mechanism. So it has a national security responsibility to investigate crimes in Canada, including terrorism crimes and espionage crimes and other kinds of things. So it has to work closely with CSIS, which isn't a law enforcement agency and doesn't have police powers. And that's a distinction that's important in terms of, again, your kind of movie images about the FBI stepping in to, and seizing control of a major crime case. CSIS can't do that because it's not a law enforcement agency. It doesn't have police powers, but it can be conducting investigations in parallel with the RCMP, where it's interested in the kind of intelligence angles of it, and the RCMP is interested in the law enforcement angles. And this can be difficult, and there have been lots of efforts over the years to try and straighten this out. It was a huge problem with regard to the Air India investigation, as people may recall, where the RCMP and CSIS did not work well together in that case, and there have been efforts to fix that ever since. But it is, I think everyone will recognize, it's an ongoing problem because they have separate but closely related jurisdictions. And
this is the final question about nomenclature and acronyms and whatever. What are the 5 I's? What does this mean?
So the Five Eyes are a very unique kind of organization. It's an alliance of 5 countries that links Canada, Britain, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Those are the 5 partners in the Five Eyes. And what those countries do together is that they share a lot of intelligence between themselves. They share a lot of information that they've collected. They share a lot of assessments. They share a lot of technological capabilities that they might be developing. And basically, the idea behind it is that it's a way for this group to kind of burden share a global problem about threats to national security. It's been around since the Second World War. The earliest elements of the Five Eyes in a peacetime setting came together in 1946, when US and UK got together as the sort of foundation stones for this. Canada joined in 1949. Australia and New Zealand joined in the mid-1950s. So this has been around for over half a century.
So can I ask, what do these countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, contribute? Because if I'm the United States and I'm the United Kingdom, I'm looking at these 3 small countries and I'm thinking, they don't have the money, they don't have the resources to be useful to us. Let's scrap them.
Yeah. I mean, that could be a question that would be asked from time to time, for example, of New Zealand, which is obviously
Right.
the smallest of the 5, and sometimes the Five Eyes are actually the 4 Eyes. But with regard to countries like Canada and Australia, obviously they don't have the same size of intelligence systems as the United States in particular, and Britain do, but they do have collection capabilities. They do have an ability to understand parts of the world, and this is particularly true for Australia and in some regions, Canada and others, that it's their partner agencies don't understand as well or don't have as good access to. They share technological capabilities, so it really is a burden sharing relationship. It's not a relationship of equals in terms of capacity, but there is an understanding that every member of the Five Eyes has something important to contribute, and they all draw from the pool of the Five Eyes kind of knowledge to a great degree.
I'd like to turn to a specific Five Eyes member, that is Canada. In an April 12th article for the Canadian Press, you state that Canada's coronavirus response highlights a failure of early warning. We could have prepared for this much earlier, in other words. In particular, you argue that careful analysis of data, including satellite imagery, would have revealed that the extent of COVID-19 in China was much worse than what the Chinese Communist Party was reporting. Do you believe that the failure is on the part of politicians and policymakers, or is it on the part of the intelligence community in failing to gather that data? Which party bears the most blame in Canada?
I think the failure, to be clear, is really not on the shoulders either of intelligence agencies directly or government leaders. The problem was that we never created a system. We could have created the system because we had all the capabilities and tools, but we never created a system to pay attention to the need for early warning when it came to global health outbreaks. There was an idea in place immediately after SARS hit Canada in 2003. There was an idea in place that in future, the Canadian intelligence system should devote resources and should create capabilities to monitor on an ongoing basis global health outbreaks. But we didn't. It was one of the lessons that was forgotten among many other lessons from SARS. It was simply forgotten. The idea, sort of faded away. And so we ended up in a circumstance, I think, come December, 2019, January 2020, where if we had a focused system up and running to try and collect special sources of information on what was going on in China, we would have had kind of additional warning. We would have had additional shocks on top of this system that we were relying on. And that system that we were relying on was basically reporting from China through the World Health Organization supplemented to a degree by media scans of various kinds. But we didn't have added into that the capabilities of an intelligence system which has a wide range of sources that it could have brought to bear, including things like imagery intelligence and signals intelligence, and maybe even some human intelligence. The only country among the Five Eyes that
Hmm.
had that capability and deployed it clearly was the United States. And this has given rise to a lot of media commentary in the US from mainstream sources about how the US intelligence community in particular was up and running early on COVID-19, providing warnings to the Trump administration, which were, it seems, ignored.
Yeah.
We didn't have that system in place. We could have, but we just didn't put it together. And my main argument in this regard is that we have to accept that there was a failure of early warning. This is not a matter of scapegoating government officials at any level or the intelligence community. It's a matter of telling ourselves we missed the boat on this occasion and we need to build this system of early warning for the next stages of COVID-19 and the next global pandemics to come.
I have a question though. You say that the United States intelligence community was warning Trump about this, and this has been widely reported in the media. It's nothing new by now. But as a member of the Five Eyes, surely Canadian intelligence officials should have known about that if that was the case, right? Surely that information would have been shared with the Canadians as well, or am I wrong?
In theory, some of it would have been shared. Some of it might have been very sensitive. There might have been some sensitivities around sharing intelligence with the Canadians when the Canadians, when our system wasn't doing any similar kind of intelligence collection or analysis. So the way the Five Eyes works is a kind of barter arrangement that you get intelligence when you can contribute. If we weren't contributing anything to our allies, we may have gotten a kind of trickle of information as opposed to a flow of it. And we may not have been well placed to do anything with the information that was coming to us, but because it's not seen as part of what the intelligence community does. So we didn't have experts in place. We didn't have an analytical process. We didn't have a sort of machinery of government that said, when an allied report comes in on COVID-19, this is how it goes up the chain to get the attention of senior decision makers. So because we hadn't created that system, in all likelihood, we did get some intelligence from the Americans and possibly other allies, but we
Hmm.
had nowhere to put it and nothing to do with it, given the absence of our own system for, if you like, health intelligence.
So would you say that this is a failure institutionally and it's a failure to sift through appropriate information in this case because of a lack of, I guess, focus on the mandate of health intelligence in particular?
Yeah, I think my view
Yeah.
of this is first of all, we have to recognize that early warning is clearly very important
Hmm.
when it comes to global pandemics. The earlier the warning you get, the better off you are in terms of imposing measures to either contain the threat or mitigate it, as is the case now for Canada and many other countries around the world. So you have to have an early warning system. That early warning system, my argument would be, cannot rely purely on open source information. It cannot rely purely on host countries reporting through the World Health Organization. It can't rely just on media scans. It has to have additional sources of information which only an intelligence community is able to provide. So we need to build that health intelligence system now. We had an opportunity to do it after 2004. We didn't seize that opportunity because memories of SARS went away. I don't think memories of COVID-19 are going to go away in quite the same extent that they have with
No.
past pandemics. And so now is the time to really learn and put this idea into practice.
And so, for instance, now we have this conspiracy theory that the virus originated in the United States, and the United States military brought it to Wuhan. And this is ludicrous. I think any scientist would tell you that. But does this mandate of health intelligence include combating misinformation? Conspiracy theories, too, right? Like linking 5G to COVID-19. Does it involve combating those kinds of conspiracy theories in the interests of national security?
Sure. So this is an important question, and I think people don't really understand what can be done and what are the limits around
Right.
what can be done for a democracy. So that the important thing I would say is, in answer to your question about, to what extent does an intelligence community have a mission to combat deliberate misinformation or conspiracy campaigns. Where that mission, I think, is legitimate and where there can be some effectiveness to turning an intelligence community on this problem is when it can be determined that these misinformation campaigns or conspiracy theories are being generated by foreign states. They're state-sponsored and are part of some information campaign conducted by foreign states with a malevolent intent, or foreign states using proxies. What you don't want to have, and there are clear indications that there are information wars going on now, designed really to on the part of governments that are conducting them, designed to deflect criticism from their own responses to COVID-19 and suggest that the real culprits in the business are elsewhere. So there are Russian and Chinese and Iranian misinformation campaigns that really are trying to target the United States as the source in various ways of the COVID-19 global problem. But where you don't want intelligence systems involved is really in the societal debate. That is,
Right.
the free circulation of ideas, even if badly informed, if replicating conspiracy theories or promoting ideas that may be dangerous actually to society. There have to be other instruments to combat that societal, non-state sponsored circulation of misinformation. That there have to be democratic instruments there, whether it's the media, public debate, various forms of democratic resilience and knowledge that you count on. You don't want an intelligence system coming in and trying to quash every bit of
Right.
misinformation circulating in a society.
So let me skip to a question I have about that. With the increasing capabilities of governments to survey citizens using things like smartphone technology and the like, we're told now, for example, with COVID-19, that smartphones can be used to survey people for health reasons. What constraints are sensible in order to prevent us from falling into an Orwellian or totalitarian society?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and people, I think, are really coming to grips with this in important ways,
Mhm.
because on the one hand, there's the technological promise that some form or another of tracking of individuals for contact tracing and containment or mitigation purposes in an epidemic setting could be very valuable to societal health. But on the other hand, you have to be very careful about, I think, two issues. One, frequently discussed, which is privacy impact. So how do you kind of defend privacy rights in that context? The other is you have to be careful not to overpromise about technology in terms of its potential effectiveness. And this is part of the debate that is now going on about to what extent can cell phone tracking, for example, be truly utilized
Mhm.
in dealing with pandemics. And the reality is that the combination of the effectiveness and the privacy protection argument, if properly applied, will get us to a space where we can see some possibilities for doing this in a democracy. But certainly in Canada, we're not there yet. We haven't figured out how to do this effectively. And we haven't figured out, and I don't think anybody else has, to be honest, we haven't figured out how to do it and still protect privacy. And it'll probably take us some time to figure out those things. And maybe by the time we figure them out, we'll have actually found a vaccine for COVID-19
Mhm.
and the problem will go away.
Well, I certainly hope so. I'd like to change now gears a little bit and switch to the issue of asset ownership. Canada is a beautiful country. We have oil, we have natural gas, we have minerals. From a national security perspective, should the Canadian government worry about foreign ownership of key industries such as natural resources or telecommunications?
Yeah, it's a great question. One that this government is struggling with at the moment.
Hmm.
And we've already seen some revised guidelines around scrutiny of what's called foreign direct investment. We have in Canada something called the Investment Canada Act, which is designed and has been around for some time, is designed to scrutinize foreign direct investment from any source On two different grounds. There's one is called net benefit analysis, which is just a calculation about, well, if you get a foreign company coming in and buying this particular economic sector activity, is that in a net way beneficial to Canadian society and economy or not?
Right.
And that's obviously a very, very loose kind of measure. And it's important for Canadians, I think, to understand that the ceiling that's imposed on scrutinizing foreign direct investment on the net benefit calculation is quite high. So
Mhm.
that net benefit analysis is only applied to foreign direct investment of a value of more than $2 billion. So
Wow.
those are big
That's
investments.
huge.
So
Yeah.
not every investment is subject to net benefit analysis. The machinery is there, but it's restricted to very, very big foreign investments. The other form of scrutiny is newer than net benefit analysis, and it dates back to 2009, and it's called National Security Review.
Mhm.
But it has been around since 2009, and it was initially brought forward because of concerns about the takeover of certain critical sectors, high-tech sectors of the Canadian economy. And it all began with concern about a takeover of a Canadian satellite company. And so governments starting in 2009 began to think, well, this may not be very beneficial, and we may need to be concerned about the national security dimensions of foreign takeovers. So we have that provision. And interestingly, national security review of foreign direct investment has no monetary ceiling. So if you're involved in a $2 takeover, if there such a thing exists of a Canadian company, it's obviously in
Sure.
distress, that would still be subject to national security review. But it's a horrendously challenging thing to do for an intelligence community. So the last annual report of the Investment Canada Act indicated that there were something like 790 foreign direct investments that had to be scrutinized for national security purposes. So you can begin to get a sense of the
That's
scale of this
daunting. That's daunting.
activity. It is
Wow.
daunting, it is challenging and complex, it requires us to know a lot. There are ministerial guidelines for what sectors of the Canadian society or economic or societal activity should be subject to national security review in particular. And one of those existing sectors is critical infrastructure, which is
Mhm.
not really well defined in the
Yeah.
ministerial guidelines, but the ministerial guidelines at least are public. Where the government is now going is saying, well, in the context of COVID-19, at least temporarily, we're going to start to consider sources of production of important health equipment and infrastructure around health as part of that national security package. And that's an important change. But we have these instruments. The challenge behind them, and we have the idea, if you like, we know the strategic rationale for them. We want to protect the Canadian economy from malicious takeover that might be in the interest of a foreign state and not in our interests. But it's very, very difficult to make this work effectively.
The deep state
Mm.
is a term that has entered the public consciousness now, and it's entered into our public jargon. It is a term which means that there is a highly politicized intelligence service which uses its clout to bend politicians and policy to its whim. Is there any truth to this in either the United States, where the term originated, or in Canada?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm going to say that there can be a
Hmm.
reality to deep state ideas, but they're mostly historical as opposed to contemporary.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is there are all kinds of examples of deep state conspiracies or fears of deep state conspiracies on the part of intelligence services that are very clearly documented on the record. So let me give you a couple of ideas of what I'm talking about. During the 1930s, in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin actually turned on his own intelligence services, the KGB, and subjected it to a vast purge in which it kind of killed off the senior leadership of the KGB because Joseph Stalin feared that his own intelligence services were powerful, too powerful, and were conspiring against his rule. Adolf Hitler, Third Reich, during the Second World War, had similar fears about the German intelligence community and turned on it, fearing that it was conspiring against him, against his regime, maybe even trying to take his life. And there was some truth to that, not as much as he feared, but some truth to it. There have been times when left-wing governments and democracies have come into power and feared their intelligence services. This was true of Harold Wilson's Labour government in Britain. It was true from time to time in Australia when Labour parties came to power. So this is a fear that has some reality touchstones in the past. It's an ongoing concern, but contemporaneously, I would say that in democracies, certainly, intelligence services have neither the sort of culture, mentality, or capability to function as a deep state. And that can be a complex argument, but I suppose what I'm really thinking about here is that democracies have created systems to control their intelligence services through law, through policy, through the scrutiny of the media, and through review, independent review of their activities. So intelligence systems, even if they had a desire to act conspiratorially, are really pretty boxed in. And I would say, just to conclude, that there's no reality to the deep state fears about contemporary intelligence services in any democracy, including Canada or the United States. They are expressions of, where they surface, they're expressions of distrust and paranoia, and usually dysfunction on the part of governments, and the Trump administration is a good example of that.
Fair enough. Now let me turn to a fun question, right? This is a fun question. You once edited a book on spy fiction, movies, TV shows, novels, etc. My favorite is Jack Ryan, right? It's my favorite right now, the Amazon Prime version with John Krasinski. In your view, which modern day spy films and novels are most similar to real life espionage work?
Right. It's a great question. I don't want to spoil the fun of it, and I think that anyone who tunes into Amazon Prime and watches the Jack Ryan series will enjoy it, and the good guys win, and there are happy endings of various kinds, and this is the sort of thing that we need just now. Clearly, I would say, in my reflection on what I call the popular culture of espionage, spy films, spy fiction, and how it depicts espionage. It's important to start out by realizing that these vehicles of popular culture aren't really in the business of providing a real picture of espionage. They're in the business of creating an idea of spying for the purpose of entertainment. Where spy films and spy fiction, I think, have excelled and gotten closer to the reality of espionage, and I'm coming to a more direct answer to your question in a minute, is where they explore the culture of intelligence, where they explore the sort of moral burdens of spying and the moral complexities of espionage. So my answer to the question is, and I don't think there are any great, well, with one exception, great contemporary examples of this, but I think the authors and creators of popular culture of espionage that have really excelled and are always worth going back to, two come to mind in particular. John le Carré, who continues on amazingly into his very late years of his life.
Fantastic novels,
writing exactly these kinds of tales around the kind of organizational culture of spying, the morality of espionage. And if any of your viewers have not taken time to either see the film or read the novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is a genuine classic.
Oh, it's fantastic. Absolutely gripping. Yeah.
Going back to. And the other person I would point to was operating in a kind of similar vein, and like John le Carré, had his own direct experience of intelligence work, was Graham Greene. And so there are a series of Graham Greene novels. People might remember The Third Man, that was turned into a film, but others that really explore this whole world of, what does spy culture from the inside look like? What are the moral burdens of espionage? And so those are my two, if you like, favorites. And there have been a lot of Greene imitators and a lot of le Carré imitators, but they are the classics.
So Jack Ryan and James Bond are not realistic.
No. If you think about the recent Jack Ryan thing, I was actually just watching it, so there's a confession. The notion that the CIA would send a team into a presidential palace and shoot up everybody on sight
That was awesome. That was awesome.
You know, it's effective in cinematic terms, but not very real.
Fair enough. Now, final question: where can we find you? Do you have a Twitter? Do you have a blog? Do you have a website?
You know, I don't have any of those things, and I suppose the hard truth is that I celebrate people who do utilize them. It's just not something I've ever had an interest in doing. In terms of, I think it's important for academics, and I congratulate you and your activities. I think it's important for academics to reach out to a broader public audience. My preferred method of doing that is through my own writing and through contributing to kind of mainstream media. I'm not saying that's the only way to do it. That's just my preferred method. And I do find, certainly, if you're a commentator in the world of national security and intelligence, you do open yourself up to a lot of kind of bizarre things that will come your way.
Sure.
And so I've not really had a great interest in opening myself up to that. So I'm not very accessible to these kinds of platforms.
Right. Well, I will put your policy options piece up, and I'll put your piece from the Canadian press up as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wark, for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Cornelia.